so much for being with us. It's great to see everyone. My name is Teresa Welsh. I'm a senior reporter with DevX covering food security, and I write our food systems newsletter, DevX Dish. I'm so pleased to be here on this stage with our panel. We're going to be talking about expanding the possible, changing how we collaborate to end global hunger. So I'm joined by Cathy Spahn, who's President CEO of Helen Keller International, Meera Shekar, who's the global lead for nutrition at the World Bank, and Eugene Cho, who is President and CEO at Bread for the World. Thanks so much to all of you for being with us. So we have been challenged in this panel to re-examine what it takes to reverse hunger trends. One of the things that we need to be paying attention to when we're talking about that is partnership and collaboration. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about different ways to collaborate, new ways to rethink that, and particularly focusing on localization and what it means to form new partnerships. And talking a little bit about what we've been missing so far in the fight to end hunger and why we haven't been able to make that happen, and how re-examining partnerships and collaboration might be able to help us with that goal. So Eugene, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about how Bread for the World thinks about collaboration and the partners that you work with when it comes to the mission of ending hunger.
Well, thank you again so much for having me. Just for those that might not be familiar with Bread for the World, we're an advocacy organization, a Christian advocacy organization. Part of that weakness is that we're not an implementing org, and so we don't have the opportunities to regularly be on the ground, to engage communities there and stories. But we also understand that localization is really important, and if we're honest, it's like the hot term and has been for a couple of years. And that's good because we've been amplifying this message for some time. I think it was starting in 2015 that Bread started really urging USAID to make localization a priority. It's taken a few years for them to, I think, really begin to create a strategy around it. So that would be one, is that we've been advocating for localization now for some time. But also acknowledging that we have that blind spot, if you will. I think organizations have to be authentic with ourselves and say, how do we have to work harder to make sure that that is prominent? And so for us, it means that we're working with implementing partners to be able to hear some of their stories, and then when opportunities arise, we ourselves are able to go. This is really important for advocacy orgs, because if we're not careful, we become folks that are just basically in the wonky boiler room versions where it's just expert talk. It's valuable, we know it's important.
And you're all just talking to yourselves.
Exactly. And so just an example of this is this coming Tuesday, a good group of Bread folks and I are heading to Nairobi, Kenya. And we're just meeting with smallholder farmers from around the continent of Africa, along with religious leaders. And our whole goal is, again, it's just relationship. And I think localization, as important as it is, as hot of a topic as it is, I think the critical essence is just relationship, mutuality, that we have things to offer, but we genuinely want to listen as well. One last thing that I'll just share is, for me, I'm a little, there's an angle for me as a president of a Christian advocacy organization. We believe that faith leaders are at the epicenter of localization in many, many communities. And so we want to make sure that we center them and elevate their voice in many of these conversations.
Excellent. Thanks, Eugene. Cathy, I want to come to you next. Your organization is an implementer. Right. And so tell us a little bit about the way that you think about localization and collaboration from the implementer perspective.
Well, I would start out saying it is not easy. I mean, if you really think about what localization is, it's giving away power, it's giving away money, it's giving away resources. That's counter to the mentality of someone running and implementing NGO who's trying to keep their organization alive. It certainly sounds like the right thing to do, but if you think about what it means co-creation. It means bringing local partners in on project design, on the template for your financial reports, on situational analyses, on designing how you're going to monitor those projects. So that takes a lot of time, but those of you here who are implementers, and you're probably all fundraisers one way or another, you know that that proposal is due at midnight tomorrow night. So how much time do we really have to engage local communities and to get them involved in co-creation. So what a lot of INGOs have done, as have we at Helen Keller, we've rethought what headquarters means, we've decentralized decision-making, we've put senior positions in the field, we've filled them with people from the countries in which they work, we focus on partnering, on building local capacity, but it's not enough. It's not close to enough, and I think we all get stuck, and Helen Keller included, in a mentality that local partners are rollout entities. And as long as we pigeonhole them that they're only rollout entities and not equal partners, as we heard a little bit in the previous sessions, it's always going to fail. We have to actually build their capacity to compete with us and to be the leads on these projects, and we have to take that really seriously. We have to consider who sits where at the table at a planning meeting, what language is in the meeting in, how safe does the space feel for people to speak up? So I could go on at length. It's easy to say, it sounds like the right thing to do, but in practice to do it right is really challenging.
And as Eugene was saying, USAID in particular has been focused on this for a long time. We can talk about that a little bit later, but there's a reason that it hasn't already happened, and it's for a lot of the reasons that you just laid out. It's hard. It's really difficult to do. And I think the power dynamic that you started off with is really a huge piece of that, because you are essentially building up your competitors and saying, you all can do it. We don't need to do it anymore.
And I think one other pitfall is we've seen some of the larger organizations focus on building local capacity or spinning off their local country offices. But what we're doing is creating mini-me's around the world, and that ain't the answer.
Yeah, just a bunch of local entities that are effectively
carbon copies
the same.
of,
Yeah, exactly. Meera, I want to bring you into the conversation and talk about the donor perspective when it comes to localization. How is the bank thinking about this, and what are some of the challenges that the bank might face that might be a little bit different from an implementer?
Yeah, okay. First and foremost, the bank is not a donor. It's a partner with the government, and the monies that we lend to the governments belong to the governments. And that's part of the Is this mic too loud? Is it okay? So the monies that we lend to the governments belongs to the governments, and we need to make sure that we recognize that. Sorry, something is not going right.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, that's an example of localization.
Yeah.
You find a local solution. So we have to think about it from day one as the government's money. That's one. We never call it a World Bank project. We call it a World Bank supported project in country X. So that's where some of the issues that Kathy was referring to, the language that you use is really important as well. Second thing, from the bank's perspective, we have really decentralized the bank. So you see many more, I wouldn't say all, but many projects are managed by TTLs or task team leaders based in country. So that's one step. Second, when a bank task team leader goes to a country and starts to design a program with the government, the first thing our team does is to bring together all the other partners that are working in country and have a conversation with them about what it is that needs to be done, who's doing what, doing a mapping of that locally again, and then help support the government to design the program. And again, we are not implementers like you, unlike you. We are not implementers. We either have the government implement or we find local NGO partners. Again, the decision lies with the government who will implement. It's their money. Keep reminding ourselves of that thing. Third thing, actually third and then a fourth. Third thing I want to mention is that the bank has been very, very emphatic about not having a project where we go in, government implements it or whoever implements it, and the project finishes and it's all over. No, that's not the way real strong focus on building what we call institutional arrangements in the country. And I don't know if you saw the recent IEG report, evaluation report across the bank group. And that really told us on the nutrition side, we're doing relatively well on that, building institutions in country. And it's not mini-me's, because we can't be mini-me's, but really building a structure that will be that is sitting within the government and that will be owned by them, and then over time can take over the program. And of course, I mean, maybe we'll talk about that later. The whole issue is about sustainability and financing as well. And last comment I want to make, picking up on something that you said, Eugene, is around using local local examples. For example, one time we worked with religious groups, the mullahs and the churches, to say, let's look at your religious doctrines and see where and how you can promote breastfeeding, for example. So it wasn't about doing the Lancet reviews or anything like that. Those are important, we know that. But really, and then saying, okay, if the mullahs can promote it, if the churches can promote it, it's much more likely to be sustainable and locally acceptable as well. So let me stop there. I too can go on forever. Thank you.
Thanks, Meera. I actually would love to pick up on that piece with you again, Eugene, talking about the particular role that religious NGOs, but as well as just religious communities, play in all of this. Talk a little bit more about why they make such good partners, and if you're going into a community, they're the people that you want to be working with.
Sure. So a couple thoughts come to mind, and maybe I'll backtrack a little bit. And I'm in a meeting with a foundation many, many years ago. No need to mention that foundation, but they basically said, hey, we made a decision not to work with religious groups. I thought that was really interesting. This is 20 plus years ago. And they were doing work in Africa. And I had to respectfully say that's incredibly arrogant. It's full of hubris, and it's very, very Western-centric.
And it's going to make it hard for you to get your work done.
Well, exactly. And it's because, going to your question now, is that relationship and trust is so important. And while there are resources that a lot of INGOs bring in, it's not sustainable if there isn't trust or relationship. Not always, but the majority of the times, I think religious leaders of all stripes, they're trusted gatekeepers in their respected communities. And so it's really important to be able to establish those relationships. And what's really interesting to me in my travels around the world, while we may not see it as often as maybe we want to here in the West, you see a lot of interfaith collaboration taking place. Why? Because when it's all said and done, water, food, nutrition, education, it impacts all of their communities. And they're really eager to work together. And so that's the reason why it's so important for NGOs to have that respectful, mutualistic, centered commitment in that goal of localization and relationship building.
Kathy, to the extent that you're able to talk about it, tell us a little bit about how the conversations between a big INGO like Helen Keller International and your donors go when you talk about localization. So, USAID, pick your whatever. We don't need to talk specifically about USAID if you're not comfortable, but is that something you feel pushed on from the donor side, or is there hesitancy on the donor side just because of the way we've always done things?
It's a great question, and it gets back to what Jerry Greenfield and Raj said this morning about speaking truth to power. As much as we want to localize, we're caught in a Western aid system, and donors are dictating what they want for financial reports. They want a certain quality of written English in the final reports. They've often designed the templates. So I do feel that with the best of intentions, we're still squeezed between donor dollars and the participants. We don't use the word beneficiary, but the participants in our program. And we really are stuck, and I think it comes back to not only do we need to work to have the local communities we're embedded in feel they have a voice. We have to develop our voice to push back to a donor and say, this proposal deadline is unrealistic. If you really want us to do co-creation with people on the ground, we need 2 to 3 months planning, but then we also need to know at the end of those 3 months that you're not going to bait and switch, turn around, cut the grant in half, or pull it away, because we now have the Ministry of Health, the local faith-based groups, everybody on board with the project so that we could co-create it. And too many times a donor will say, oh, gee, you know, we only have $1 million, not $2 million, or can you double the deliverables? So it is really hard because we're dependent on donors. Helen Keller is 95% funded by restricted grants. So can we collectively, if we're all here to be bold, be a voice back to donors about localization sounds right, but then you've got to leave a lot more room for what it takes on the ground.
And what does that do to, you know, your relationship with the partnerships that you're trying to build in a community like that, where you've essentially gotten buy-in for a particular project, a particular scope, and then you have to be the bearer of bad news and tell people, oh, sorry, this is actually not what we're doing anymore?
You know, it's happened a number of times, and it's really painful. It really hurts our relationship because we've got government entities and local groups have spent a lot of time, and then we have to say, gee, sorry. And it does happen. So it hurts those relationships. It certainly destroys trust.
Mm-hmm. Meera, I want to come back to the point that you were making about sustainability, you know, when it comes to bank-funded projects and, you know, the money that you're giving to governments and they are spending. How do you ensure that once, you know, the World Bank funding for whatever project has elapsed, that that whole ecosystem has developed partnerships to carry on the work of, you know, whatever it might be?
Well, first, to echo what Kathy was saying, it's not easy. It's what we aspire to, and in some cases we are successful, in some cases we are not so successful. It's important to recognize that. I think from our perspective, the issue I mentioned about building a local institutional arrangement for implementation is absolutely the first step. And like I said, our independent evaluation group first assesses us on not whether you just delivered the services, but whether you set up an institutional arrangement or not. Secondly, financing is absolutely critical. You know that if you want to sustain the program and if bank resources are no longer available, then it's a problem. In some cases, like in Madagascar, for example, we agreed from day one that this is going to be a long-term project, a program. So from day one, the bank committed for 10 years rather than the usual 4 or 5 years cycle. So that's recognizing that this is going to take longer. In other countries, Senegal being an example, where we worked with the government to implement a program, we put in place a really first-class institutional arrangement. The government owns it. We also advocated with the Ministry of Finance to make sure that some resources are allocated within their medium-term expenditure frameworks so that in the future, these programs can continue with that kind of support. We still will continue the quote-unquote advocacy, though we don't quite advocate with the Minister of Finance, but we are not necessarily able to follow every project with financing. So that's sort of the dual approach that we try to do. And we, as Kathy was saying too, we have a lot of really excellent staff in the field who are lead. In fact, as we speak, I was supposed to be in Nigeria for a data event to advocate for a nutrition program. And I said to her, no, you don't need me there. You can do it. I know you're excellent. So I sent a little recorded tiny thing, and the rest of it, she's going to lead on it. And I think that's the way to build capacity and sustain the thing. The last thing I'd say is we've been working with parliamentarians in countries and using that pressure to advocate within the country about why it's important to sustain these programs.
That's really interesting about you encouraging country teams to really take ownership in those processes. Do you feel like folks sometimes hesitate because they feel like they need the kind of bang power of headquarters? You have to come because you're coming from bank headquarters in DC, and people might listen to you more. I mean, is that how people feel about it?
That's exactly the conversation we just had. And I said, no, your voice counts much more than my voice. You know the country, you know the context, you know the politics in the country much better than I can ever learn. So it's all yours.
I have to laugh because in my world, headquarters is a dirty word. So, different dynamic.
You're not allowed to say headquarters?
We don't say headquarters. We have global and we have local.
Okay.
But whenever anyone says HQ, it's with a sting behind it.
Oh, I see. Okay, it's kind of a burn. Okay, I got it.
We call it mothership.
Oh, I like that. That's more neutral, I feel like.
Yeah.
Eugene, from an advocacy perspective, are we ready for this change towards more true localization? What, from your view, is standing in our way?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that's the million-dollar question for all of us. But if we truly want something that's sustainable and long-lasting, we don't have a choice. But the good news, from my perspective, is that localization has been happening for a long time. But we haven't named it or acknowledged it, or we haven't given it its right platform. An example of this is that the reality is for many implementing organizations, having in my previous chapter done some work in that sector, INGOs have always used local partners in some form or another. It's the only way that we can do it, along with our folks on the ground as well. But I'm not sure if we've always given the proper attention and elevation of these local voices. Many, many years ago, I remember an NGO getting sued by a local partner because this local partner began to realize that this INGO was taking all the credit for what this local partner was doing and gave no credit whatsoever, no acknowledgement, no story, no photos. It had basically packaged it, marketed as, hey, we're doing this work, and now we want you to help raise money for ongoing work. And it was misleading. It was not true. And I think the worst thing is that what they did is they really took away the power and dignity and the hard work. And so I think the reality is we have a lot of local partners. It's hard, it's challenging, but one of the ways that we can, I think, keep building this is telling more authentic stories about what local partners are doing right now.
Kathy, what keeps you inspired when you're doing this work?
It is the local people on the ground. It's our staff on the ground. It's the partners we work with. It's been very tough during COVID not being able to get out there and actually interact and meet people. But it is the people.
And when you think about nutrition and food security work in particular, do you see any specific challenges towards localization that might make it easier or harder than perhaps some other sectors?
I think the challenges are still on the donor side, that donors are so prescriptive. So it's one thing, as I said, to have local partners who are implementers, but if they're really going to have say, and I'm coming in with, here are the 6 Lancet interventions that we're bringing to your community, and they're like, well, we only want 2 of those. Here's what we want, but the donor has said, these are the 6. Mm-hmm. So I really come back to that point. We can't just look at local entities as implementers, but how do we give them the power within the confines of the whole donor aid system?
Mm-hmm. Meera, does the bank have that problem where, sometimes perhaps the scope of a grant and lending is a particular thing, and then when you actually get on the ground, you discover that the needs are different?
Yes, most certainly that happens. And I know the bank is criticized heavily for how long it takes to design and approve a program. It's mostly at least a year, sometimes longer than that. It's partly for that reason that you go in there trying to, with some mental model in mind, and then you sit with the communities and you sit with the ministries and you realize actually you need to do something a little bit differently. And that process takes a long time. It's not always comfortable, that conversation, but it needs to be had, and it is had. So that's at the beginning, but we also have something called, in a 4 or 5 year program, a midterm review. And at midterm, you review again what your mental model was, what targets you had set for the country or the program, and what seems more sensible at this point. And at that point, you can change things still. And it takes a process, as everything in bank bureaucracy does, but it's possible to do that. And task team leaders are completely in control of that conversation and the change in targets, change in even program design, if needed, whatever is needed to make sure that we can achieve what was set out to be achieved.
Kathy, how often do you feel you have that flexibility in the middle of a project? You were saying, the majority of your funding, comes from grants, and you've got to do the project as it was originally pitched and signed and sealed. So how much flexibility do you find that donors have for you going to them and saying, hey, we thought we were doing X and it's actually not working out that way, can we pivot? Do they say yes?
1 in 3 times, I would say, and it really depends on who the donor is. I think you all know this. There are some donors who are really hands-on, but some in a good way. We've got a program right now with Eleanor Crook Foundation, and they're in Senegal right now meeting with the community members to ensure the project design is what the community members want. So that's a good example. GiveWell is a good example. But then there are other donors where, no, this is it. This is what you have to deliver on. We want to see your progress against these milestones. That's what you signed the grant agreement for. So 1/3 of the time, there's leeway, but I'd say 2/3 of the time, not really.
How do we get donors to change the way they're operating?
Having the courage to speak power to donors, having the courage to walk away from funding opportunities, which we've done a couple of times for that reason.
Wow.
But that's hard. You're carrying your own staff. You've got your own costs you need to meet. So that's where self-preservation kind of runs against localization a little. As I said, we really need to build their capacity to compete with us. One of our goals, 5 years ago, our goal was we want to prime more on large opportunities from USAID. Our goal now is, can we build local capacity and sub to a local organization who primes? Aspirational. Yeah. That was a word I heard earlier.
But just to add to that, I think the other thing that can change people's minds is really hearing from the communities, from the ministers themselves, gets up and says, no, this is not what we want. Nobody can argue with that. Mm-hmm. Not even a difficult donor.
One last thing that I want to bring into this conversation, we've been talking a lot about partnerships when it comes to the organizational side. Eugene, I'd love to hear from you about localization when it comes to advocacy from the perspective of how you bring in different communities to be interested in this issue. Ultimately, if we're going to end global hunger, we have to have the financing and there has to be the political will to do it. So how do you galvanize communities to help push in that direction?
Yeah, I think it happens in a couple ways, because our theory of change, if you will, is how do we engage our legislators to inform and transform the way that they see policies and legislation that we think can make significant impact. So I think it begins in threefold. One is we ourselves, as advocacy and policy analysts, we've got to make sure that we acknowledge our blind spots. This is why we have to invest in our staff to be able to go on the ground and to see and to hear these stories in a time where we could kind of plug and play from the internet lots of things, and there's a place for that. There is something very granular and important about being on the ground and sitting in someone's home and hut and to be able to genuinely hear these stories. That would be one. The second thing is that we try to educate our constituents on the ground. Bread for the World has members in every congressional district. And so we want to make sure they don't just have the top talking point about good policy, but what are the stories that we've been able to glean to be able to share with them, that they can share that with their members of Congress. And the last one is that somehow, whether it's through Bread or through our partners, is how are we seeking to inform our actual members of Congress. Some of them go with implementing partners to be able to go on vision trips or site trips so that they can also see that it's a complement, kind of a juxtaposition of good policy, good story, and hearing directly from people on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful things I've heard from members of Congress who didn't understand why we do what we do when it comes to food security and nutrition. You take someone to the field and the light bulb goes off.
Yeah.
Alrighty, well, we are out of time for this panel. Thank you so much to the three of you for being here and joining us. Really appreciate it. Let's give a hand to our panel. Thanks. So we will now be moving into the second part of this session, expanding the possible of the big think. I'm going to be joined by Cathryn Dhanatya, who's the president and co-founder of Growing Good, and Noam Unger, who is the VP of Development Policy, Advocacy, and Learning at Interaction. And we were meant to have a third panelist for this session, but unfortunately he's not feeling well. So we're going to do our best to carry it, the three of us. Good morning. Thanks so much to both of you. You guys ready to carry it without Gokul?
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to do
I'm
great.
not.
Yeah.
I don't have a choice.
Too bad, we're up here. So in that last session, we were talking a lot about changes that need to be made to the system of development when we are thinking about ending hunger, changing the way we operate, changing the way we think about partnerships, who we work with, who we're empowering in the field. So we're going to be talking a little bit about kind of what's required institutionally and in a way of thinking to be a disruptor and, as Kathy was saying, to be the person that stands up and says, no, I'm not doing that to a donor, or that's not really what a community needs, and being the person that's able to make those changes and shifts and really rethinking the way that we're doing our development and humanitarian assistance. So Noam, I'm going to come to you first. The big think is a phrase that comes from work that Interaction is doing. So tell us a little bit about where that came from and what it means in practice.
Sure. Thanks, Teresa, and thank you as well to the organizers of this event. I think that, let me start with a bit of the context. For me, that's important, and this may have already been shared in these last couple days, but it bears repeating that we have made progress globally, right? I mean, since 1970 to, just a decade ago, global hunger was cut by 2/3. And just from 1990 to about a decade ago, it was cut by 10%. But that progress, right, stalled about 7-8 years ago. And the compounding factors of conflict, climate change, and even the pandemic, which added about 150 million more people to the rolls of the hungry around the world, have really added pressures, right? And so we have been making progress, but that progress has been outstripped by the pressures that exist. And it leads us to what is legitimately a current crisis globally. But the crisis isn't just a blip on the radar. It's not just a one-time thing. We are bouncing from global food security crisis to global food security crisis, right? And so we tend to focus on the most severe acute instances, and then we focus on responding. And the reality is that, I work at Interaction, which is a platform of INGOs, and we come together and collect our voices with grounded experience, and Eugene spoke well to this in terms of advocacy just now, to bring those accounts of the needs to the halls of power. And an example of that is just this past spring with the compounding effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right, on food security globally and markets and fertilizer and so many different things impacting people around the world. The administration put forward an emergency supplemental request to Congress, and that was for $1.5 billion. And it was the NGOs who stood up and actually leaned on their trusted relationships. These are conservative-leaning NGOs, progressive-leaning NGOs, backed by so much evidence and support that basically stood up and said, no, that's not what's needed, that is not enough. You need to fund this emergency supplemental at least $5 billion. And what was the result? Congress funded a supplemental at $5 billion, not $1.5 billion. That translates into a lot of difference in terms of programming. And we should, as NGOs, feel very proud of that, but not satisfied, not complacent, because we know that the humanitarian response is never going to be enough to this cyclical nature of global crises around food security. We need to focus more upstream. We need to actually, we don't have the time or the money to focus only on humanitarian response. And so that has led us as a community to do what we're calling the big think and to look back at what are some of the bigger levers, the bigger ideas, even though we've made progress in areas, and I can talk about this on Feed the Future and other efforts, we need to think a whole step change differently. And this conference is a part of our process of beginning to talk across our coalition and really identify what are those different policy asks that we are going to be bringing to a new Congress in the next year to really elevate the issues that we want to focus on in terms of prevention and resilience.
And how important is it to get everyone on the same page when it comes to this process?
Well, it doesn't hurt. I mean, the reality is that, when you are a policymaker sitting at the State Department, the White House, USAID, or in Congress, if you're hearing a lot of different messages, it can be confusing. If you are hearing a resounding message from trusted partners and interlocutors who have real presence globally and connections locally, that makes a difference. And if it's unified, it has the opportunity to be powerful. And that example of the supplemental was where the community came together and was very clear.
Cathryn, I want to bring you into the conversation. So your business trains people to be disruptors, and you help organizations sort of figure out how to go about doing this process. Tell us a little bit about how you do that and when a client comes to you and how that might be applicable to the context we're talking about today.
So I think I need to give you context also about how I came to be this person, right? So I'm kind of like the Swiss Army knife of people, right? I've had a very varied career. I've been a researcher. I've sat in your seat as leading a very large nonprofit organization. I was a donor on the donor side. So I've applied for grants, I've reviewed grants, I've given out hundreds of millions of dollars and raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And what I realized was the system's a little broken, or a lot broken. And one of the things that I learned from my donor days was I was the head of our scientific portfolio at Stand Up to Cancer. And we would give out about $150 million a year for research, which is a significant number. And our grants were very large. They were $10 million, $20 million grants. And they really championed this idea of team science, which was, traditionally, we're a cancer research organization. We're going to fund clinicians. We're going to fund oncologists. We're going to fund biologists or biochemists. And Stand Up was like, no, we are going to fund those people, but we want you to add a physicist, or we want you to add a mathematician, or we want you to add a computer scientist to your grant. And the reason for that was we want somebody who's going to give you a different perspective. And I found that in communities, we all talk and we may disagree, but you're all kind of on the same page overall, right? Ideas, it's really hard to think outside because you're in this sort of ecosystem. You're trained the same way, you read the same books, you go to the same conferences, you do all of these things that are the same. So how do you disrupt if you're in an ecosystem that's all with colleagues that you know. There's not as much direct challenge, like, well, have you thought about doing it this way? What if we added this algorithm to doing this work? And so Stand Up, in its 10 years, was able to get 7 drugs through the FDA. That's unheard of, because we really wanted to think outside of the box. And so that was very profound to me as I kind of thought about what I wanted to do next. And I wanted to think about something like team good. And this would include everything from philanthropists and donors, but also for the NGOs and the nonprofits that are doing really important, meaningful, impactful, life-changing work. It's not just about your community, it's about also breaking those bonds and moving forward outside of your community. It's about collaboration that's beyond who you know. You know, this is an amazing conference, and I think it's amazing that everyone's here and everyone's talking, and there's been a lot of really interesting ideas. But what I think is really important also is, why aren't climate people here? Why aren't people in education here? Why aren't people that you can partner with outside? I know we talk a lot about partnership, but really expanding that scope. And as a donor, I think it's a lie that there's not enough money. There is tons of money. You just have to look in the right places and think about it differently. And the truth of it is that in nonprofits, we tend to see things as a pie, right? Like there's a small pie, and we're all kind of frenemies, sometimes competitors, trying to get the same piece of that pie. But what happens is when you expand your reach and you look at intractable problems more globally, now you can go for climate money. Now you can go for education money, because those are all pieces, if you have the right collaborators, that expand your possibilities and opportunities. And that's how you disrupt. That's how you change things, is when different ideas are brought into your ecosystem that change your way of doing things, that change your way of talking to donors, right? People have different types of expertise that are different than yours, and being able to learn from that and grow from that and bring that in will help to really change the conversation and help you to keep growing and changing. And also, the donor landscape is changing. I feel like I could talk a lot about that, about the proposal situation is not going to be the same in the next couple of years. And that's really going to be a huge shock to the nonprofit system, because donors are changing and what they're looking for is changing. So, start there.
Thanks so much for that. I think that's such an important point about the silos that we often find ourselves in when it comes to development and humanitarian work, and how we do sometimes find ourselves in an echo chamber where a bunch of food security, nutrition people are talking to one another, but not reaching out to the climate people or not reaching out to education people. And I do think some of that has been changing slowly, particularly after the UN Food Systems Summit. A lot of the impetus for that event was to start breaking down some of these silos. But certainly there's still a long way to go, and I think the climate issue is particularly pertinent. And we are talking a lot more about that in the nutrition and ag and food security space, particularly leading into COP this year. So I think that is a part of the conversation, but still so much more work to be done there. Noam, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about how folks in all levels at organizations can be involved in this. So, obviously you have folks in management, you have heads of organizations that are really in control of strategy and thinking about how organizations work and what they're doing. How do we encourage people that are perhaps at a lower level to also participate in these processes and ensure that their ideas are heard as well?
I actually think oftentimes and even maybe increasingly so, the change that's happening within organizations is actually coming from lower levels within the organization. We're living in a time of societal change, rapid societal change, driven by technology and other factors, and so with that is a bit of a generational divide. I think I can relate it back to this point also about climate, because when we think about the global food security and nutrition challenges, so much of it, as we've talked about, is driven by climate change-induced extreme weather, its impact on agriculture, and so many other aspects of it. And yet, several years ago, I remember looking across the INGO landscape, at least from the US INGO community, and the community was actually doing less on climate change related issues than it had been in the run-up to the adoption of the SDGs in 2013, 14, 15. Why was that? Well, the reason, which does not actually stand up, was because the political winds had left during the Trump administration. Well, that does nothing to affect climate change or its impact on all of our work and the missions we care about. And so, one thing that we did, and this was driven internally by a lot of younger people at lower levels as well, was we mobilized to take a new approach across INGOs, a collective approach to climate change issues. We felt gone are the days that relief or humanitarian action and development NGOs or global health NGOs can say, well, we're not environmental organizations, so climate change is really somebody else's issue. We're not gonna. That's just not acceptable. And yet organizations need to learn from each other and improve their own practices and learn from other experts outside of their realms of current expertise. And so we created the NGO Climate Compact, which has a set of commitments across different pillar areas of, advocacy and engagement, sure, but also what NGOs are doing on their own programming to mainstream climate change into their programs. And keep in mind, some of these organizations are billion-dollar organizations with tens of thousands of employees around the world. There's a lot of impact there. And then those same organizations need to be thinking much more seriously about their own operational and organizational sustainability. And the fourth pillar is around learning from each other. And for several years, a growing group of NGOs, many of whom are represented here, a growing group of NGOs have signed on as signatories to this compact to meet certain commitments and measure their change across how they are doing a better job of incorporating climate change as a priority across different elements of their work. And it has had a good effect, including on our advocacy and our efforts to be disruptors, right? Because when the Biden-Harris administration came in, our alliance came in with a set of ideas around adaptation to very forcefully shape some of the strategy consultations at USAID, at the White House, and really played a hand in helping to inform even efforts like the current presidential initiative on adaptation and resilience. And that's really important if we're actually going to try to shape change.
And Cathryn, when you're working with organizations, how do you work to frame rethinking disrupting as something positive, not a negative reflection on things that were wrong, things that were bad that we were doing before, but something positive in a way to create change going forward?
Well, I think the emphasis on growth and having a growth mindset, like Carol Dweck's idea that you have to be able to be open to learning. And I don't think things as failure, I just think it didn't work this time, right? It's not yet. So you have to be resilient, and organizations that are going to survive and are going to thrive have to be able to adapt. And so I think for me, when I talk to my clients or I talk to different programs or initiatives that I'm trying to help work out, they're all messy. I like messy things. I like things that are big and hard because it's things that are hard for me that are meaningful. And if it was easy, anybody would be doing it, right? So therefore, it's going to be complex, it's going to be difficult, but you have to be optimistic too. And I know that when we're faced with so many dire statistics, so much pain, so much suffering, it's really hard to believe that it can be better. But if you don't believe it can be better and you're in this business, then why are you doing this, right? So going back to that core of having that optimism, building that persistence to keep moving forward, and then being able to be agile, to be able to change, to be able to learn, to be able to bring in new ideas, and to be able to have difficult conversations, right? I think that that's what we all owe to each other as colleagues, as people who are working on the same mission, to really be able to say, you know what, I don't think you're right, and this is why. And for those people to come back and say like, oh, okay, they're coming from a good place, so let's talk about it. And we may never agree, and that's okay. But I think being at that table and willing to listen and to be able to have your ideas evolve, that's what's going to change your organization. And trusting your people. Like trusting the people that you've hired, that they're capable, that they're smart, and that you don't have all the answers as the leader, right? Like you're there. I really believe in service leadership and being that servant leader of really looking at that mission and really trusting the people that you've brought in to give you perspectives, to give you different ideas. And some of them may be bad, right? Like we all have bad ideas. But I think that that's okay, because then you can recognize that and be like, okay, that's not a bad idea. We're not gonna do that. But then being able to communicate that back. Sometimes we're so busy that it's really, really hard to just sit and listen and communicate. I will give an example too. Like as a funder, I get thousands of requests, right? And for me, if you can't explain to me what you're trying to do in like 5 minutes, I don't have time to read a 50-page proposal, right? I don't have time to try to decipher and try to, even if I want to, what you're trying to do. So if you're not clear, and I come from the private philanthropy world, so our boards are not always scientists, or they're not practitioners, or they're finance people, they're different people from different backgrounds. They want it quick, and they want it fast, and they're busy, and so it has to be clear. And I think making sure that that message is clear throughout your entire organization, from the person who is your receptionist all the way to your CEO, you should all have an esprit de corps, right? You should all have a mission that you believe in, that you can recite, that you can go forward, because they're gonna be your best ambassadors. They're gonna introduce your ideas on social media, they're gonna introduce your ideas to their friends, their parents, their colleagues. All of these are potential donors. And if you can't have an ambassador corps beyond your development team, you're never gonna be super successful, right? And all of those things have to align. Your operations have to make sense, your finances have to be in order, your regulatory stuff has to be in place, as well as the work that you're doing. And if those things are not in alignment, you're never going to be able to break through to the larger donors. And the donors who, because a lot of these people, especially if you're looking at the private sector philanthropy, they're all business people, right? And we don't always speak in business terms, right? We don't always speak in ROIs and all of that. But what you're doing is so important. It's crucial that you get those people's ears, because that's a lot of where the money is. You know, governments are limited, the federal, and they kind of have more limits. But if you can get into that other space, there's more freedom, there's more ability to pivot, and there's more ability to build things that are new. And so I kind of want to I hope that all of you think that be courageous in what you're doing. Don't be afraid to try something and fail, because it's okay to fail. It really is. If we think about all the scientific discoveries that would never have happened if somebody just gave up, right? And this is what you're tackling is so important and so meaningful and so life-altering for millions and millions of people. You can't give up, even if it's hard. So that's what I would say to people.
I want to pick up on the point you made about agility and so much of what you were saying of, you know, what an organization needs to look like to really be able to innovate, rethink, disrupt in this way. Noam, how often do you feel your member organizations really are set up for this? Or are folks really kind of stuck in structures of the past and kind of have a hard time with agility and innovating and changing rapidly in this context?
I think, you know, I'm reminded of Eugene's comment in the last panel about how, you know, localization is something that the community has been doing for a long time, and some of the language has caught up. I think in a lot of ways, there's a parallel, and that nonprofits, especially like resource highly resource-constrained nonprofits, they're actually often forced to be nimble. They're often forced to adapt to changes because of powers greater than themselves. Some of the funding pressures that Kathy was talking about in that last panel, they actually force innovation in organizations as well. And so I actually think NGOs often get a bad rap for being a little bit like sclerotic or solidified. These are organizations that are constantly changing, and there's a dynamism to them. And I see that from where I sit because I sit at a platform where a lot of these NGOs come together to learn from each other. And this speaks to your point about building anew and learning. This is a really dynamic space. I don't think we can easily just sort of label organizations or a whole industry, this industry, as sort of dinosaurs, because there is a lot of innovation that's happening. There's a lot of sophisticated partnering after decades of discussing, what does it mean to adopt and adapt, innovative tools of finance, or to partner with the private sector in concrete ways, and not just the philanthropy arm of the private sector, but core line businesses of the private sector, and how does the sort of nonprofit sector meet? That adaptation space is vibrant. So I think that there's a lot of innovation. I think that, again, the challenge is that the pressures that are mounting, we haven't done a good job of adapting to all of them. A key one, as I've already talked about, being climate change. I don't think the development in humanitarian space has grappled enough with what the current pressures and the trends mean for areas like food security, like nutrition, in terms of climate change, and how that means that they should change their practices. But I'm seeing a lot of effort growing in that space.
Cathryn, what message do you have for, we've got heads of INGOs and other organizations in the room. What frank message do you have for them when it comes to, disrupting, rethinking when they're leading their organizations?
I think the message is the same, which is be courageous, be brave to try new things. It can be scary, but I think it's completely essential for you to be able to move forward. And then make friends, right? Make friends not just with your peers, but across, around, and even people who aren't necessarily in your wheelhouse at all, right? You can learn from everybody. And then the last one is always try to be curious, right? You want to be able to think differently, to look at things differently. When I started, I said I was a Swiss Army knife. And part of me, when I take experiences and everybody I meet, I feel like I almost have a toolbox, right? And I get this tool and I put it in here. And you may not see all of those connections in the beginning, but as you grow and as you move forward, those things can be brought out, or those different contacts can be brought out. And don't be afraid to try things that seem a little bit wacky or outside of the box, because there should be fun, and there should be enjoyment, and there should be joy in the work that you're doing because you're making a difference, even if it's hard. And I think that when you have that passion and that drive, and you really believe in what you're doing, that's gonna permeate your organization, right? If you're completely stressed all the time and just worrying and all of these things, and I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but if that's the pervasive view, it's gonna create an organization where people don't wanna come to work, right? People are tired. There's so many things. So you wanna be able to move past that and create an environment where your greatest asset isn't the number of grants you have, isn't the number of dollars you have. It's the people that work for you. It's the people that you serve. And don't forget that, because those are the ones who are gonna make your mission work or not. And they need to feel that they're valued, that they're respected, that there's human dignity in the work that they're doing, and that what they're doing makes a difference. Even if I am just answering phones and filling out paperwork or putting envelopes into the mail, for you, I need to feel that that purpose is valued, because those are the people who are going to build your organization, who are going to bring in new donors, who are going to bring in new connections into your organization and new ideas. And so that's what I think is the most important, is the value of all of your staff, from whatever they do, all the way to the top. And if you can build an organization that does that, then you're going to be able to be successful, because you're going to have new ideas, you're going to have new innovation, and you're going to be able to grow and change and bring in really good people who want to stay. Because turnover sucks, right? Let's be honest. It's a headache, it's costly, and it really, really disrupts the work. So I think that that's something that I would really encourage organizations to think about, and leaders.
I love that point about joy. I think that's really relevant in this space. It can be hard to have that sometimes. I mean, I feel it sometimes as a reporter, to feel excited about what I'm doing when the news is so terrible. And if you're working at an organization, fighting hunger right now, Noam gave us some of the numbers, things are not looking good. It can be really hard to sort of have that joy in the work you're doing, not because you don't think it matters, but because the landscape is just so bleak. So I think that's a really powerful message to have that attitude. One last question. Oh, go ahead, Noam.
I was just going to say, I mean, maybe this is where you're going with the question, but yes, and we have faced headwinds like this before. I mean, if you go back to the 2008-9 period, we're facing global food price hike crisis, and at the time, there were innovations, and there was a lot of unified sort of elevating of speaking truth to power, elevating voices. A lot of NGOs came together with government, with the private sector, to pledge and create new things that were big in and of themselves. Feed the Future is an example. The Global Food Security Act is another that was actually adopted in a bipartisan way in 2016, reauthorized in 2018. It just, another reauthorization of that just passed the House. These are good examples of the type of change that can happen. We just need to think bigger about the scale of the change, because the reality is, Feed the Future, if a USAID study of its work in Ethiopia is to be extrapolated, right? For every dollar spent on that kind of resilience and prevention program, you save $3 on humanitarian response. That's how we need to be thinking. We just need to be thinking at a much grander scale right now, given the pressures, than we have been in terms of Feed the Future. And that's what we need to build forward. I think there's a positivity to that.
I think that's the perfect way to end. I like to end on a positive note if possible. Thanks so much to Noam and Cathryn for being with us today. Thank you.
This. Think of that. Megan, you know what time it is. So, how's everyone doing? All right. Seen this before, you know what to do. It's that time. We have opened up 2 more new questions. We'd love for you to take a look at them. We are about to go into our afternoon break. I want to say good night, good evening, and thank you to all those that have been live streaming. The Twitter feeds, the social, the chats really have been remarkable. It's really been something that we did not really expect. We also wanted to recognize how messy and wacky all of this has been very unorthodox. I would often say it's been a little heretical, and that's probably also something we can embrace. While we're doing the polls, let me just give you some logistics. We have 1 more concurrent session for our in-person colleagues, so that by this afternoon you will have rotated through all 3 sessions. Afterwards, we're going to reconvene at live stream at 3 o'clock, where we will have a little bit of a report out of the most provocative session, which is our declaration session. We'll hear from those facilitators on the feedback. What was it like? Do we keep it? Do we rip it up? What do we want to do with this? And as we've been saying here, you guys get to decide what we're going to do with this. So we welcome you back at 3 for that session. I'm also very surprised, and for those that are very pleased to share a surprise, that our poet laureate will be joining us. And as a preview, a young, really incredible woman has prepared 3 customized poems for our movement. And she's done that, and she'll share that in part because we have all used words here today to express our commitment and our authenticity of what we wish. So to our live stream, thank you again for joining. We hope you will join us back at 3. Just a reminder that the documentaries are fully available. We do hope you will take an opportunity to review them and listen to the preamble from Marshall Stowell. All right, so let's look at our first question. Do you think SDG 2 can still be achieved by 2030? Yes, yes, but no. So we'll start bringing in those responses. Okay, well, thank you, those 9%. We applaud you. Tell us how we're going to do that. We really need your help. 51% of us, and we're in this business, say no. All right, oh no, what are we going to do? Because I'm in this business, I got to figure something out. I got to do something differently. And those that are saying yes, but, tell us how. Tell us the change that we need to do. Our second question, how much disruption is needed in the anti-hunger community to achieve SDG 2? So we're very fortunate today. Both of our panels earlier today, our keynote from Jerry, kind of said it's going to get messy, it's going to be uncomfortable, stick to your values. Kathy had us be brave and say, look, no, this isn't going to work. The equality of both a business mission and a social mission. Truthfully, business mission, social mission. How do we keep that rigor? While at a break, a colleague said, we gotta get comfortable with our discomfort. And I went, ooh, okay, I like that concept, but I need help knowing how to do that. So part of the responses here are how much disruption is needed in the anti-hunger community to achieve SDG 2. And the results are massive to moderate. It's nice to know that there's no disruption. We kind of are embracing it. It's a good thing. In fact, thank you to Cathryn who reminded us it's okay. Disruptions can be positive. So this afternoon, again, we'll reconvene at 1:30 for your last concurrent session for the in-person audience. Our live stream audience, join us back at 3. We'll have a little bit of a report out on the declaration. We will hear from our poet laureate, and then Charles will MC kind of our last round where, we can actually come together. Maybe there'll be a photo in there, maybe. All right, thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch. See you back here at 1:30.
Ladies and gentlemen, please clear the room. This program has concluded.